I've played Flesh and Blood competitively for 4 years now, and over the course of my time making videos and playing the game, I've briefly touched on many topics related to high-level play, but don't often delve deep into the concepts themselves. Today's video sets tangible goals for you to improve as a player, with each set of tips being built on the last. They all work together, and you have to start with a good foundation. Advanced level tips aren't effective unless you have the groundwork done, and by the end of the video, you should know where you can improve, regardless of where you are in your fab journey. Starting in the beginner stage, it seems simple, but it's very important that you have mechanical knowledge of the game. You have to know how to play. This involves reading the basic rules, watching a tutorial, or solitarying your deck at the table before a game. Get familiar with the mechanical functions of playing, pitching, bottoming, and arsenaling cards. This will help you build confidence in your ability to interact with the board state and reduce the mental fatigue during a match, so you can be more focused on other aspects of the game rather than the physical act of playing cards. Once you know how to play the game, it's important that you find a deck list that is tuned and works. The deck you bring to an event is the one thing you have control over in the game. Make sure you're playing a deck list you believe is well tuned. There's nothing wrong with net decking a successful list, and information sharing is an important part of the game's ecosystem. Play what is proven to work until you have more experience in the game. After multiple years, strong players have done the legwork, and it's a resource that you should use. Even if you're playing an off-meta hero, try to find online or local resources to refine card choices. There's nothing wrong with following a recipe. Once you know how to cook on your own, you can make different choices. Now that we have a deck and we're playing, it's important to talk about hand conversion. Hand conversion is one of the most important parts of playing turn cycles, the shared turn between both players before you redraw your hand at the end of your turn. Be intentional with every card in your hand, being careful that you're playing efficient math. Compare each attack and block value and try to count up to the best total block/attack number of your hand, and then adapt to what your opponent is doing. If you block with a card, consider what your remaining 3 cards do and block the least important piece of that puzzle. We call this blocking down, and the worst thing to get cornered with in Fab is blocking with a card, your opponent passing, and you realizing you could have blocked with a different card and had a better 3-card hand. Be intentional with every card you keep or block with. You should be able to defend every block or attack choice you make once you become proficient enough. Practice thinking about every way you could play the 4 cards differently. Once we have our core fundamentals down, it's time to start moving into game plan identification. If you don't know how your deck wins, you simply aren't going to win as often. Determine what game plan your deck wants to execute and identify which cards are key to spiking wins, also known as heuristics. Create mental shortcuts by knowing what your most powerful cards are. If you are a proactive, reactive, or combo deck, know how those archetypes win games. It'll get more complex as you move further on, but it's important to start with a simple idea of what your deck does and when it needs to function as intended. If you're playing a proactive deck, you attack with your cards and don't block if necessary. If you're a reactive deck, you want to extract as much value over turn cycles and try to stop what your opponent is doing. Combo decks set up a few powerful spike turns and aren't as concerned with turn-to-turn math values. These are simplified ideas, but at a level 1 understanding, you should be aware of how your deck operates. Once we have our core foundation set, it's time to move into intermediate concepts. Most players' journey into this stage is usually revolving around matchup knowledge. Once you have the initial concepts down, you can refine gameplay strategies within matchups. Know who is the beatdown between your 2 heroes, and what strengths and weaknesses each of you have within a match. Become familiar with their power cards and how they interact with your deck. For example, Brute can arsenal Blood Rush Bellow and sculpt a 5-card hand to push over a defensive deck, but against aggro it can prioritize smaller hands with disruption. This also involves knowing your deck well enough to practice things like pitch stacking, intentionally putting certain sets of cards on the bottom of your deck, most often via pitching, to redraw later in the game. The other half of matchup knowledge is sideboarding. What cards you bring into a matchup can drastically affect the match. This is built on matchup knowledge and familiarity with other heroes' decks compositions and play patterns. For example, Verdance has the Healing Pot Potion combo, a powerful sideboard plan to play a slower game and execute a high power turn that can scale up to 30 plus damage in a single turn. This combo isn't viable versus aggro decks, which may run you over before you assemble all the pieces, but it's very effective against slower decks that can't close the game out fast enough to stop you from building the engine. This is one example, but it highlights how sideboarding can completely flip a game, and it's important to use this in combination with matchup knowledge for the highest value possible. Think about individual cards in your sideboard and what heroes they're good into and why you're including them. At the base level, consider a sideboard for the top meta heroes or a sideboard plan for the different archetypes of the game. Next up is armor use. Your armor starts in play and is one of the most important lifelines during a match. Know when to cash it in. Knowing your opponent's key cards and possible on-hits will determine when you decide to use blocking equipment for defense. For example, once you play against Jarl, You can identify that a Fused Oakenold is a strong tempo piece of the deck, and you can choose to save a defense reaction in your arsenal and some armor ready to help block it out with a card from hand. No small micro decisions for hand evaluation and a macro perspective for matchup knowledge. Activated abilities that are one-time use are incredibly delicate, and pulling the trigger at the wrong time can cost you a game. Reflect after a match on whether or not there was a better time to use your equipment for its intended use. Finally, to wrap out intermediate, we have ratios and deck building. While copying homework is a great way to get familiar with the game, once you become knowledgeable about not only your hero but also their matchups, you can consider making your own changes. Deck building is a difficult skill, and you can spend a long time iterating on existing lists or building something from scratch. Always make sure to test your changes and reflect on which cards are serving your game plan well and which ones should be adjusted. Once you identify your hero's game plan, power turn, and matchup plans, you can use this knowledge to adjust your deck's ratios. This involves both your resource curve and other percentages such as attack to non-attack ratio, elemental count, etc. Think about how your hero text interacts with the card pool and what signposts are being given to you. Also consider what power cards are available and what deck building requirements they demand. Good deck building takes a long time and is the last step to master before venturing into advanced concepts, but it's something you'll constantly be refining during your time as a card game player, not just in Fab. The Hyper-Geo Calculator is your best friend. We finally move into the advanced stage. At this point, we have a lot of fundamentals down. We know how to deck build, we know how to play certain matchups, we know how to sideboard appropriately. We have good math fundamentals, and we can play micro decisions well within a match. In the advanced stage, things break down and become a little bit more theory-based. To kick off the advanced stage, we have game state adaptation. Know how to adjust to how your opponent is playing. While an intermediate understanding of who is the beatdown is serviceable, knowing how to change mid-match is an important concept for high-level Flesh and Blood. This requires tracking power cards, including your opponent's pitch stack, and occasionally checking their graveyard to keep tabs on how many of a certain card are left in deck, while also being aware of yours as well. For instance, if you're playing an Agromir against Dash.io and you notice that all three of her maximum velocities have been banished or blocked with, and your health total is still very high, you could consider completely pivoting to a fatigue-based game plan and try to win the match that way. Or if you're playing against a Guardian player and you keep track and notice that all of their pummels have been pitched away, you can play with the safe knowledge that you're not going to be on the receiving end of pummel, but also you can have full knowledge of when they will be redrawing those. And this lets you adapt your game plan in both cycles. This also helps with seeing how an opponent is posturing. If you notice that your flooring opponent is fine blocking with their fellings when they could resolve them, ask if your turn was incredibly powerful or if maybe this player is aiming to fatigue you. Be aware of how your opponent is playing and what the game state is. So if you're required to pivot your game plan, you can start sooner rather than later. This also changes how certain cards take on different roles in the endgame. If you add the life lead to keep something as low value as a 0-for-1 with Go Again, your opponent is at 1 with no armor, it may be correct to take 3 damage to use it offensively to strip your opponent's hand of cards they need so that you can close out the endgame. You need to understand how all this happens in real time without the aid of post-game analysis. The goal here is that you can recognize these as you're playing the match, and rather than having to reflect on what you could have changed about your game plan, you're able to act on it immediately. Implied value is where the math of Flesh and Blood breaks down. Identify how cards can throw an opponent off their game plan and determine if it's theoretically valuable to resolve them. Common example is Spinal Crush into aggro. While it's mathematically better to block with it and another blue for 6 and send your hammer for 4 for a total value of 10 as opposed to sending it for 9, the value of resolving it has an implied value. Your opponent has a hand of all 0-for-4 Go Again attacks that they would send back for 16, but are forced to block with 2 or 3 of them and potentially still take damage. You gain an advantage that would not be quantifiable with a strict math approach. Hand values are good fundamentals to keep yourself from losing margins, but true high-level gameplay comes from plays that deviate from that rule and aim to gain a different edge. Knowing your outs. One of the most unspoken skills of the game, knowing what cards are left in both players' decks, and how to make calls during a match. A classic example would be Arthur Trehey winning Pro Tour Los Angeles by taking a strange blocking decision to dig for the only card left in his deck that would win him the game. Recently at Calling Valencia, Paul Van Ysel took the finals by making a risky play against Samo Plenic. Paul is staring down multiple boom grenades and is trying to block a max velocity. However, Samo has 2 floating, an extra action point, and a backup protocol red. While Paul could use his blood in the water, destroying the ally in his hand to block a total of 10 with his armor, the follow-up of a likely 0-60 recurred from Grave would connect both boom grenades. Paul decides to take the high variance line, where if an ally is destroyed from the top of the deck, the remaining one in the hand can be used to pay for quick dodge flexors to finish covering both the max fee and the 0 to 60. Paul takes a seemingly risky line because it's the only available out that wins the game, and is rewarded for not only recognizing the situation, but leaning into the hypothetical variance. This takes a long time to learn and comes with the previous concepts of knowing your deck list, ratio, composition, matchups, and what the current game state requires you to play towards. Variance is a part of card games, and it's occasionally a tool you need to leverage to get an important win. Last up, we have meta-analysis, the final piece of becoming a strong competitive player. Meta-analysis is the most crucial tool when trying to do well at tournaments. If you brought the wrong deck to a tournament, all the previous knowledge is helpful, but it won't always carry you across the finish line. Being able to identify the best positioned decks at any given time is important to choosing what to play at an upcoming event. This requires you to have mastery of multiple archetypes and heroes, and isn't always feasible unless you have enough time to practice properly and refine your deck. Going a step further, meta-analysis requires you to always be paying attention to the state of the game, as shifts can happen mid-season. Recently, we've seen an uptick in Arachne Marionette to counter the dominance and popularity of Syndra. At the next major event, it may be important to consider playing Marionette, reconsider whether Syndra is still the correct pick, or at the very least, practice so your first game in recent testing isn't during your match at a tournament. Meta knowledge helps you develop strong testing regimens by dedicating time to practice with intention against the top heroes. This helps you refine game state adaptation, implied value, and identifying outs later on at that event. If you are a specialist in a single deck or class, it's even more important to understand the meta so that you can prepare the most robust deck list to combat the expected metagame, specifically your sideboard choices. While you can't guarantee you'll play against the anticipated top decks in an event, having your finger on the pulse of the metagame is what helps top players refine the best lists or find a rogue pick to try and spike a tournament run. Now that we've concluded the 3 different stages of learning, how do you actually implement these tips? There's a few different ways you can do this. Pay attention to your games even at an armory level. Ask your opponent what went well and also what went wrong. If you're playing against a more experienced player, pay attention to the lines they take and ask after the game if there was something you want further insight on. Record or test games outside of an armory setting with locals, Talishar, or an online coach. Time spent practicing will pay dividends in your improvement as a player. Quality practice will always beat quantity, and try to be intentional with your goals beforehand. Consider other learning resources such as YouTube, podcasts, or written articles. Specialize in a class or hero for a while. Spending time on one hero will let you refine the concepts talked about earlier at a faster rate if you're not dedicating mental energy to relearn how to play your deck properly. Once you master a deck, consider branching off to practice and familiarize yourself with other decks so you can have options to pivot based on the meta. Goldfishing your deck can help you learn the motions of the game and help you build heuristics on how you would play different hands so you can shortcut time during a match, which is very important for tournament play. Watch tournaments and see how top-level players adapt their strategies. Seeing both players' hands gives good insight to what they may be thinking about when making their plays. Knowledgeable casters also go a long distance in helping viewers learn. Set aside time to practice with the top meta heroes before a tournament and adjust accordingly if you know your local scene deviates from what is normal at global events. Try to understand how those decks can adapt during a game and what changes you need to make to your own play patterns to stay ahead. Think about how you can play to win rather than play to lose. Try to identify within a game when you need to take a higher risk play line, followed by the other half of the question, which is asking, do I need to make this gamble to win, or is that unnecessary? Hopefully these tips are able to help you out in your fab journey of learning how to play this game at the highest competitive level. There's always more to learn and practice, and even I'm still not at full proficiency with a lot of the things I'm talking about today. The goal of this is knowing what your goal should be within testing and how you can improve as a player. My hope is that you enjoy the game above all else, and until next time, thank you for watching.